Greetings, Rich.
Hi, Tim.
How are you?
How's it going? Not so bad. I had a big life experience a couple months ago. I got married.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
That's wonderful.
Big adjustment for a guy who's was as single as long as I was.
Have you never been married before?
No.
My goodness! Wow.
No.
Well, congratulations. That is a big change.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
We should
how are you?
we should introduce ourselves. I am Timothy Noah. I am a senior editor at the New Republic. I was until recently a senior writer at Slate magazine, but I got laid off. I joined the vast army of the unemployed for a couple of days. Cheap publicity stunt for my forthcoming book on income inequality. And I am now working for the New Republic. I write the TRB column and I write a blog. And you are Rich Lowry, editor of the National Review.
National Review, absolutely.
And married.
Fortunately, you weren't part of the ranks of the long-term unemployed.
I was fortunately not part of the ranks of the long-term unemployed. That's right. I deserve no sympathy whatsoever. But,
yeah, and as a highly educated person, you are unlikely to join those ranks, which is
I am less likely, although I'm just a college graduate, and that doesn't really cut it in this economy. But I got in while the getting was good for college graduates. Now you really to really make it in this economy, you need a graduate degree, which I don't have. Do you have a graduate degree?
I do not. I'm with you. Yeah, that was something I learned from that Don Peck article in the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it's now the postgraduates who are really raking it up.
Yeah, the so-called college premium has actually, which got sort of steadily worse after 1979, dipped a bit, and it basically was supplanted by the graduate school premium. The college premium meaning the additional income you can expect to get as a result of having a college degree. And now there's not much additional income you can expect to get unless you have a graduate degree. This is all very bad news for those of us who are parents of college-age children, as I am. My son just entered college. I sort of thought, oh, right, college, okay, well, it's really expensive, but, I'll sock away some money for that. And now this whole graduate school thing. I can't quite figure out how people pay for graduate school. Do you know?
Isn't the norm? And I didn't attend graduate school myself, but it just always seems parents tend to pay for college, and then the students tend to scrimp and save and take fellowships or work or whatever to
pay. Yes, that's what I've heard too, but I don't see how the numbers add up because the sort of tuition costs have gone so high. Maybe they haven't climbed quite so high for graduate school. I don't know, but if they haven't yet, they will because of the increasing demand. So that will be the next social problem.
The cost of tuition is another massive problem, and I am sympathetic actually to the thrust of what Rick Perry has been was starting to try to do down in Texas with regard to higher education. I just think that the whole system needs to be fundamentally rethought. Why there are a lot of people who are getting degrees that don't really require being in college, in my view, for 4 years. It would be wonderful if we could find other ways to credential people besides a 4-year degree. So to me, I think we're just trapped in this mid 20th century, or I don't know whether that's actually where it dates from or not, but the system that doesn't is very rigid, not very flexible, increasingly expensive, and needs to be rethought.
Well, part of the difficulty is with college education is that a lot of what we today call college education, in the old days we used to call high school education. There's a lot of stuff people used to learn in high school that they now learn in college, particularly with respect to composition. it's a common complaint that kids show up in college, they don't have the first clue how to write a grammatical sentence.
Yeah, my father is retired, but he was an English professor at a school down in D.C. for a long time, and by the end of his career, he was just extremely depressed because he was, as you say, was teaching basic composition, things that at the beginning of his career he could just take for granted that students would know, and they just didn't anymore.
Yeah. No, it's a big problem. I also think actually that although I don't think that the imposition of cost controls by the federal government is normally a terrific policy, I think that there are times when the market kind of leaves you no other choice. And we're starting to see that, I think, with healthcare, but I think we're also seeing it with tuition costs. I mean, you sort of look around at certainly the more elite colleges have, it seems to me, never known anything that even vaguely resembles austerity, and I think that's a concept they have to acquaint themselves with. And the government has some leverage there. I mean, a lot of these schools, especially the elite ones, depend very heavily on federal funding. And I think the feds are going to have to, at some point, make, as a condition of federal funding, some controls on increases in tuition. Does this make you gag?
It does, yeah. I think these are two areas where I think healthcare and education where government has kind of messed up price signals, and where we don't really have true consumers the way we do in other parts of the economy. And what Perry was getting started before, distracted by his presidential campaign, doing down in Texas was just insisting that these universities, state universities down there, just run themselves more efficiently as a first step. But I think once you get to price controls, you get all sorts of other distortions.
Well, what's the difference between telling them to run themselves more efficiently and imposing price controls? Don't they achieve the same effect? Or saying they have to spend less money? Isn't that? Aren't they both ways of insisting that colleges spend less money? Which, of course, with public colleges, is well within the rights of the state legislature. And I would argue with private colleges are at this point half public themselves because of their reliance on federal money. But certainly, the state legislature in Texas ought to be free to tell the University of Texas or Texas A&M how much they can charge in tuition, can't they?
Yeah, in theory they could. What Perry was focusing on is things like so many resources devoted to things that don't directly impact the classrooms. Research in things that don't really add much at the end of the day. We're not talking about basic scientific research. We're talking about research in English and history that gets published in extremely obscure journals and doesn't really advance the sum total of human knowledge. So he was looking at a thorough just renovation of how the universities work down there, because in general, education is a very fat and happy sector of our economy that depends on massive direct and indirect subsidies from the government. So I'm always very hesitant to endorse price controls. So I'd have to look at this area much more closely before you take me down that path. But it's something that I think everyone assumes works well. That doesn't, because we're proud of we have great institutions of higher learning here in the United States, and there's that college premium or former college premium that we discussed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the status quo is serving us well or as well as it should.
Well, the Perry approach, as you describe it, sounds more to me like micromanaging than price controls would. I mean, I don't particularly trust the Texas legislature to be able to figure out what the priorities of the University of Texas should be. I'd much rather they told UT, look, you're going to get this amount of money, and you can charge this amount in tuition. You figure out how to make the numbers work out. You're the educators. You figure out the priorities.
Do public schools basically decide what their tuition is outside of their?
There probably is all
the
sorts
state
of government
legislatures?
input, but I'm guessing it's not too directly from the state legislature at this point. There are probably all sorts of buffers, I would imagine, right? Chancellors and regents and whatnot.
Yeah, all of whom are appointees. So, I mean, you're indirectly controlling it,
Right.
I would imagine. But this is an area I should have prefaced all my remarks. I know very little about. So.
Right. Well, actually, I know a little bit more, but not a lot either. But there was Andy Ferguson's wonderful book. Did you read? You've only
just read the reviews.
Yeah. He quotes this guy, this economist who's at AEI. I forget his name, and he says, why does college cost? Why do they charge this much for tuition? And he says, because they can.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, of course,
yeah.
Absolutely the answer. People will, spend unbelievable amounts of money to educate their children because they know they don't really have much choice in this economy, and that's a somewhat corrupting reality for the people who are providing that service. Anyway, we should move on to the news. But first, wait, let me show you. This is my new office. I want to show off my new office. I'm very proud of my new office here. Give you a little tour because I have 2 couches. There's one couch. There's another couch. 2 couches. So I feel as though I have really kind of made it in life.
Did Chade have 2 couches?
This is Chate's office.
He had 2 couches.
I don't know how that guy... I don't think I could have gotten 2 couches on my own. I think I really had to ride on Chate's coattails to get 2 couches, because I would never have had the nerve. But got handed to the guy. He got himself 2 couches. Now, one of them has, something thrown over it, so I don't know what the hell it looks like underneath it. But still, they're couches. I don't think I even ever had 1 couch before.
Yeah, I don't entirely understand office couches unless you have a lot of visitors, because who's really at the office going to sit around on his
naps? You can
couch?
take naps on your couch.
I guess so. I'd be in favor of a much more accepting culture for work time naps, but I don't think we're there.
Napping is important. The other really amazing sort of news of the day for me was that I was bringing some books from home in, and I parked next door. There's no garage in this building, but there is a garage in the building next door. And I'm coming up in the elevator, and I enter the lobby with my carton of books, and who should I see coming into the building next door but Jack Schaefer, the other guy who got laid off at Slate Magazine. Turns out he works in the next building over from me for Thomson Reuters.
So is he taking Jim Pethokoukis's gig?
I don't know that he's taking anybody's gig.
Okay. I saw Jim tweet about Jack Schaefer, so I drew that conclusion perhaps unwarrantedly.
I don't think they're Thomson Reuters is going on a hiring binge, so I don't think they're counting slots at the moment. Excuse this shop talk, ladies and gentlemen, but
this might be one of the more insidery 15 minutes of blogging heads ever. Well, they lost everyone.
Well, it was just funny to me and Jack, because Jack and I we had a dysfunctional marriage at Slate, where we were always kind of arguing with each other, and we were really kind of like an old married couple, and obviously nothing can keep us apart because there he is right next door. Anyway, well, enough shop talk. We should move on to the people's business now. What shall we start with? I guess we need to start with Obama's speech yesterday, right? Which
Yes.
I know, I saw the editorial. You guys hated that speech. Can you summarize for me, for the people back home, why the speech was an abomination before the Creator?
Yeah, we hated it for basically all the reasons that everyone on the right, including the clutch of Obama sympathizers at the New York Times, David Brooks, and less so Ross Douthat, but Ross as well, was going a little wobbly on the jobs plan, and now has been horrified by the speech. The savings are ridiculous. There's the Iraq and Afghan wars, which savings from them are inevitable no matter what anyone does, because we're going to draw down inexorably there. He's counting the savings already achieved in the debt deal. Cast a little bit of a jaundiced eye on them because they're about $7 billion or so, I guess, in the fiscal year coming up, and they're extremely backloaded. And basically, the rest of it is technical changes to Medicare and Medicaid, doubling down on IPAB as a way to ultimately kind of institute.
I wouldn't call them all technical changes. Some of them are coming out of the pockets of old people. There's some co-payments.
The means testing stuff very backloaded, right, with 2017. There's a little bit there, but it's overwhelmingly tax increases that aren't going to happen.
Whoa, not overwhelmingly tax increases. It's half tax.
No. Because they do the doc fix, but they don't actually count the doc fix as part of it. So that's another 200, 300 billion. And then you have the jobs bill itself, which is part of his program. So if you add all of that in, you have no savings whatsoever, and it's all tax increases. 1.5 trillion in tax increases.
Are you part of the camp that says you can never ever raise taxes? You can never even think about raising taxes until the end of time?
I prefer being where we've been historically, which is about 18%, 18.5% of GDP. And if you want to change it, let's do it in as part of an architecture of a tax reform. And what President Obama's proposing is just
proposing tax reform.
Well, what is it?
He's proposing lowering the rates and eliminating loopholes. Paul Ryan has been calling for the same thing.
Let's see the bill. And in the absence of a tax reform, which is practical matter we're not going to see, he just wants to raise the taxes, and we'll take the rates effectively up above Clinton levels. There's all this rhetoric about millionaires and billionaires, but you look at the reality of it, and he's going to tax single people 200,000 above, couples 250,000 and above. So that the millionaire and billionaire thing is highly misleading rhetoric.
Well, what's the matter with charging families $250,000 and above?
Well, and he's also going to do this, beginning in 2013. And we really believe that the economy is going to be growing at 5% a year or something, and unemployment is going to be plunging in 2013, such that the economy is so healthy that you can begin instituting all these various tax increases, including ones beginning to come in with Obamacare right in 2013.
Well,
and plus the expiration of the payroll tax, which he's now, tax cut, which he now portrays as, a world-shaking stimulus to the economy, which again, he's assuming in 2013, you can let that expire with no consequence whatsoever, and all these other tax increases on top of it. And it's all, fundamentally an evasion because he doesn't want to deal with entitlements. He wants a political theme to take into the campaign. The only way he can pretend to do something about the deficit is tax increases because his base loves that. And it's basically all that they'll abide, and it polls well. So what he has here is not a realistic or practical program. It's a campaign theme.
Well, let's talk game theory for a second. I mean, the Obama has tried the reasonable guy thing. Would you agree that that really hasn't worked very well for him?
Well, I don't think he was a very reasonable guy, because I'm not sure that what he was talking about behind closed doors was very real. I just knew
he was talking about significant, what even you would acknowledge were significant entitlement cuts with John Boehner, and Boehner backed out.
This is why David Brooks calls himself a sap, and this is why I wasn't a sap, because I knew if push came to shove, and he actually had to go public with these very bold, courageous ideas that he was constantly patting himself on the back about, they would disappear.
Wait. It's Obama's fault that it's Obama's fault that Boehner backed out of the negotiations on entitlement cuts? How does that work?
If President Obama had these very far-reaching, courageous proposals on entitlements, and they were real, and he really supported them, he's the President of the United States.
And Boehner could not tolerate them because they were paired with tax increases.
President of the United States, he has a debt problem. He should come out in favor of them. And he never did. It was entirely behind closed doors. And you talk to Republicans who were in all these negotiations with Biden and Obama. They said you actually sat around the table, and it was not as certain as they portray it. And all the cuts tended to evaporate. So if he really wanted to lead on this, he could have led. He could have taken that fancy bus, black bus, and toured the Midwest and said he's going to raise the eligibility age in Medicare. If he really thinks that's a good idea and a way to take care of the problem.
Let's talk about it in this sort of stark, again, game theory terms. You've got one side, that's the Democrats, who are saying we've got to get there with tax cuts and we've got to get there with spending cuts. We've got the other side that says, no, we can only get there through spending cuts. Am I describing the situation accurately?
Right, tax increases.
Tax increases, sorry. Yeah. Now, that's problematic, right? If you've got sort of one side that's willing to use both available options, and the opposite side says, no, we will only use one option, and that is spending cuts. That creates a certain practical negotiating difficulty, right? How do you lure the other side into reasonableness?
Well, I mean, there's a big embedded assumption that only one side is reasonable. And look,
yes, I think it's reasonable if you have a deficit crisis, it is reasonable to propose that you use all available tools to address it and not tie one hand behind your back in addressing it.
Well, yeah, if you think it's reasonable that we have government spending close to 25% of GDP.
Yes.
But there are a lot of people who don't think that's reasonable. And we already have, I mean, their tax increases as part of Obamacare. The Bush tax cuts are scheduled to expire. I think the reasonable thing, if President Obama were really this brave, post-partisan person he prides himself on being, which he's self-evidently is not, he would have said, okay, we'll put the tax increases past the election. You know, we'll argue that one out, in November 2012. But here's my proposals to very seriously deal with entitlements that I myself constantly say are unsustainable. And he didn't want to do that because it's an enormous political risk, and his base would go crazy.
But when is it a good time to talk with Republicans about tax increases? It's never a good time. It's not a good time before an election. It's not a good time after an election. So the Republican Party has become absolutist in its refusal to ever support tax increases. Even reasonable John McCain, when he ran in 2008, was boasting that he had never actually voted for a tax increase, although he did support them. He just didn't vote for them in his past. But
well, the president could have said that his advocacy, or thought that his advocacy of tax increases would be so popular that he'd sweep to re-election in November 2012, which is what you think would happen, and he could do the Chade option, which is I'm going to veto any extension of the Bush tax cuts in any form, and there's a big fat $4 trillion tax increase right in his lap. There it is. All he has to do is get reelected. So he could have, and this is my whole take on the course of his presidency the last 3 years. Even if you believe the Keynesian theory that the $800 billion stimulus created 3.5 million jobs or whatever the figure is, and that was an absolutely necessary thing to do to keep us from falling deeper into a hole, fine, do that. but do the Alice Rivlin option. Say, okay, we need the short-term spending, but then the medium and long-term, we're going to do big, bold things to get us on a bigger path. He's constantly talked as though that's what he wants to do, and that's the kind of politician he is, but he's not.
He needs a negotiating
never been able to
partner.
step up to the plate.
He needs somebody. What's the line that Bush always used to use? I'm not going to negotiate with myself. I never felt like I knew what he was talking about when he said that, but now I sort of feel like I do. Obama has done a lot of negotiating with himself. He did it on health care. I mean, they kept talking about how it was a bipartisan bill, but they kept cutting deals with these non-existent Republicans who were willing to come on board if they made certain concessions. And Republicans ended up not voting for the bill. I mean, at a certain point, you have to come up with some sort of strategy that recognizes the intransigence of the other side.
Well, I mean, I don't understand, Tim. He's the president of the United States, a country that has very serious entitlement problems, as President Obama says, and has a debt problem, as President Obama says. He's the president. He should come out with a blueprint to very seriously address it, and he just hasn't. And Republicans, you can bang on John Boehner for walking away from the deal all you want, but Republicans put themselves on the line by voting for the Ryan plan, which does take this stuff on. Over the medium and long term, and it is actually extremely politically risky.
But it doesn't talk about
and
taxes.
They did it because they did it because they took the public seriously enough to put their ideas out there publicly and vote for them. And the president on entitlements just hasn't done anything comparable at all.
Well, if you wanted to talk comparability, you would. Paul Ryan plan would have proposed tax increases instead of proposed tax cuts.
No, I mean, see, this is where we disagree, among other things, is, people on my side think that the tax burden, once we get beyond this recession, if we ever do, it'll bounce back up to around 18%, where it's been the last several decades, and that's where it should stay. And we've had a historic run-up in spending, and the spending should come down. And that's a big disagreement. There's no obligation on the part of John Boehner to give in on that, and we're going to end up having a big debate about it over the next 14 months, and it will be decided maybe not in whole, but in part in November 2012. But I'm just saying Obama has not lived up at all to his self-image or his own rhetoric about telling people hard truths and all the rest of it. I mean, it's just I wonder whether he even believes that self-image. But if he does, it's kind of pathetic.
Let's talk about specifically about the. We haven't talked about the Buffett rule. You loathe and despise the Buffett rule. You think it's an abomination. You think it's an abomination that a billionaire should pay as much in taxes as his secretary does.
You're hitting on all the abominations. Well,
and it gave David Brooks a terrible tummy ache in today's New York Times.
Warren Buffett pays himself $100,000 a year. You can take all his income.
Right.
And it's not going to...
$100,000 a year is more than $60,000 a year, which is what you guessed his secretary made.
Right. Well, but, if the secretary has a husband who makes a comparable amount, that's a family that makes more than Warren Buffett. And look, he's obviously gaming the system to avoid taxes.
Well, you don't need Warren Buffett to make this point. I mean, Citizen for Tax Justice has a report that shows that the top 400 earners in the country paid like 18% effective tax rate, which is down from about 22% in 2000. At the same time that their share of national income has been increasing. So I think it is unquestionably true that you've got people at the very top who are paying very little in taxes.
Right, and I mean the reason why they're paying so little, presumably, right, is they get a lot of their wealth through investments and whatnot, and we just don't tax that at the same rate because it's effectively double taxed, right? I mean, even Democrats have supported historically having a lower capital gains rate than the personal income rate. And I think
they have
economic theory.
They have sometimes supported it. They have sometimes not supported it. Sometimes they have said income is income. But in any case, I mean, if you sort of step back from it, regardless of what the sort of particular reasons are, isn't it just not good for the 400 wealthiest Americans to be paying less in taxes than middle-class Americans?
Well, I mean,
we're not even talking about asking them to pay more, which is, of course, what I really think. But if you talk about progressive taxation these days, you're a class warrior.
Well, I mean, we do, Tim. We have a progressive tax system.
Well, all Obama's talking about is having, these 400 families pay the same.
Right.
The same amount.
I mean, what you would do, you'd have to hike taxes on capital gains and on investment. And when we talk about tax reform, I think one of the premises that most people work off of is you want to tax consumption rather than investment. You want to encourage investment. So, the downside of that is, you have some people who make, all their money off investment are going to have a rate lower than people who don't. But do you really want to disfavor investment in the cause of making these 400 people pay a higher rate? And I think that's harming the economy and economic growth, and ultimately the cause of having more jobs in kind of a political crusade.
Well, Buffett wants that. I mean, Buffett in his op-ed piece, he didn't make a big deal of it, but he was basically saying that capital gains and income should be taxed at the same rate, if I read his op-ed correctly.
But you end up taxing them more.
Why
right?
does Buffett think that? He's an investor. He's a billionaire. He was branded as a socialist for this op-ed piece, but he's clearly not a socialist. He's a guy who wants to make a lot of money.
Well, because he's the third wealthiest person on the planet.
Second, I think.
He can afford any tax rate. And as a practical matter, my take on this, a lot of cable TV types say, "Oh, why doesn't he just give all his money to the government or pay higher taxes voluntarily?" My take would be he should give all his wealth away.
He probably is going to do that
a charity.
When he dies.
Yeah, we'll do it now. Just get rid of it all. Move to Westchester County, move to McLean, Virginia, move to the suburbs of San Francisco with his wife, adopt a couple of young kids so he has a young family again, and just make arrangements so he only makes $250,000 every year.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's see how he likes being lumped in with millionaires and billionaires, as the president does, and see how he feels about his taxes being increased when he actually has to worry about expenses. Again.
Well, we have found a point of agreement here, which is that I also don't think that people making $250,000 a year should be lumped in with millionaires and billionaires. I think millionaires and billionaires should pay higher rates, which is actually what Buffett called for in his op-ed. The Obama version is a very mealy-mouthed interpretation of the op-ed, where he's merely saying that Buffett should pay the same as the secretary. And in fact, what Buffett said was that there should be two new brackets, one at $1 million and one at $10 million, to reflect the reality that in the current structure of income distribution is such that people who earn $250,000 a year really aren't. Well, they're rich, but they are not as rich as they used to be relative to, because there are more people making a lot more than that who are consuming a larger portion of the nation's income. If income is becoming increasingly concentrated at the top, doesn't that argue for creating new basically chasing that income by creating new tax brackets higher up?
Well, I mean, we already have a system that is pretty steeply progressive. One,
but
two,
you just said
actually,
that people who make $250,000 a year shouldn't be compared to millionaires and billionaires.
correct. I don't think we should raise their taxes. I mean, you do obviously, right? I mean, you support the Obama.
I say you
which
should.
is
Yes, you should go back to the Clinton
taking away
levels
their
on-
deductions and raising their rates. So you support increasing the taxes on the very people you say.
Yes,
don't
I just say
pay
you should
more
be,
taxes.
but I say you shouldn't lump them together with millionaires and billionaires because they should be paying at higher rates. I think it should.
No, well, I mean, I would support
Even higher, I should say.
probably about two rates, ideally.
2 rates.
And yeah, a much flatter sort of
Less progressive.
system. Yeah, well, look, the problem is at the end of the day, you can have this rate for millionaires. How much are you going to get from it? I mean, we're still a mass middle class society. We're fat in the middle when it comes to income, and if you really want to raise taxes in such a way that's going to make a difference to the real world and the actual deficit we face, rather than just having a campaign talking point, you're going to have to tax the middle class. You're going to have to, as Paul Krugman has said in his more honest moments, you're going to have a VAT. So you're going to have to go much further down than that. And for me, that's totally anathema. What we should do is intelligently retrench and get spending back down to 20% of GDP or less, at historic rates. What President Obama is trying to do is preserve as much of a historic run-up in spending so we can have as large a government as possible.
Well, let's talk about that sort of vast middle class because the vast middle class is shrinking. There was an interesting piece on it I saw in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, where Procter and Gamble is kind of reorienting their marketing strategy. You actually have executives at Procter and Gamble suddenly talking about the Gini coefficient, which sort of blew my mind. And they are readjusting to what they refer to as an hourglass economy, where they're seeing that the target markets much more as being bifurcated into the top and the bottom, and much less so in the middle. The products where they try and reach the middle aren't doing so well, so now they have this new bar of soap, I forget what it's called, they're trying to market to lower income people. So what does Procter and Gamble know that the IRS doesn't?
Well, you can have the millionaires tax, and we're still going to have an hourglass economy if that's truly what we have. What we're talking here is about long standing trends. I don't have to tell you, you've literally wrote the book on it, that can't be solved with any kind of quick fix. And I don't think...
I agree, yes, I totally agree that you cannot fix the inequality problem through taxation. You can. I think taxation is a good start, but no, you have to do much bigger things because the trend is the trend wasn't caused by taxes very much. It was caused by much larger forces in the economy, many of which were influenced by the government, but not so much through taxes.
Well, and I mean, you have your millionaires tax, and it doesn't make anyone's wages go up. So it's for me, it's a total misdirection. And actually, if you get the Krugman vision of this government still at 25% of GDP or who knows more, and a VAT, you're actually hurting people further down the income scale. So we need to, at the very least, I don't think any of us, maybe you do, but as I've seen, no one really has a ready solution.
Doesn't Krugman favor a progressive? I would guess that Krugman would favor a progressive VAT, where you exempt certain goods, or you
perhaps. I've just seen him
to
refer to
incomes.
how we need a VAT desperately, because you have to get at middle class income. You have to tax the middle class ultimately.
Well, I don't
to
disagree with
sustain
that.
this sort of right.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, this is again why I just find the whole millionaires thing a misdirection and sort of inherently demagogic, because that's not going to fund what President Obama and the Democrats want to fund. It's just not. So, and it's also not going to address these sort of long-term trends that you've been grappling with in terms of income inequality. And my preference is let's do the kind of the big things the big things right: tax reform, entitlement reform, getting the deficit under control, and trying to create a better environment for job creation in this economy, as a predicate of everything else. And then let's have a conversation and grapple with the problems we have, in the middle class and the working class, because I don't discount them, and I think they're real. It's just higher taxes in the upper income may make certain people just sort of feel better about themselves, but it's not a very realistic solution to any of this. Either reducing the deficit or dealing with the problems further down the income scale.
Well, let's move on to the horse race here. Who's going to be the Republican nominee? Is it going to be Romney?
I know that's what you think.
It is what I think. I cannot believe that Perry is going to be the nominee. I cannot wrap my tiny mind around that. Do you think it's going to be Perry?
I don't know. I give him, and we're talking before the next Republican debate, so we'll see, but I would give him slightly better odds than Romney. And I hope I'm not just being driven by the poll numbers, because it's so easy to tailor your interpretation to who's up or down in the horse race in any given day. But he just seems a more natural nominee. He's currently in the fight. He's a current office holder. He's been the governor of 10 years of a very big and important southern state. He is more conservative than Romney, and at the moment his entire affect kind of plays into what the core of the Republican base wants. They want someone extremely plain-spoken and very combative, and Perry has been all those things. So at the moment I see Romney a little bit more the default option if Perry proves utterly inadequate, which I don't discount. Mm-hmm. I thought his first debate, I graded him a little more kindly than others did, just because he was so loose and confident and blunt and kind of entertaining and seemed to be having fun. And I think that counts for a lot, counts more, I think, probably with most people than the substance of your answers. But by the second debate, I changed my mind a little bit. He was still loose and confident, but the answers and the substance were so terrible. I do think it created some qualms in people's minds. And you're seeing Perry, in the polls, he's settled down a little bit. The lead over Romney is now in single digits, so it looks very
it can't be good for it can't be good for the front runner that he makes the editor of National Review wince. That's not a good thing, right?
Well, there was a much stronger front runner once upon a time who made me wince even more, named George W. Bush, whose debate performance, people forget this,
was bad.
Although no one who watched should ever be able to forget those early debates in 1999. He was just horrible.
Yeah,
horrible.
It was fun to watch. McCain just sort of cut him to ribbons.
Yeah, so Perry is much better than that. I assume he's going to get better, but we'll see.
Here's one thing that sort of stops me whenever I think about Perry being the nominee is it would really be new and different. Maybe we live in a new and different world, but how do you nominate a guy when the de facto leader of the party cannot stand? He doesn't just make Karl Rove wince. Karl Rove cannot stand the sight of this guy. He has undisguised contempt, I think it's fair to say, for Rick Perry. And surely that's a problem.
So who's the de facto leader? Karl Rove?
In the absence of anybody else.
Oh, I think Karl. I like Karl, he's an extremely talented man, but he's not the leader of the Republican Party.
Who's the leader of the Republican Party?
I don't think there is kind of a titular leader of the Republican Party.
That's why I said de facto. Yeah.
Well, yeah, very, very de facto, but he's not. It's a very grassroots time in the Republican Party now, very volatile, and it wouldn't surprise me if Karl, with his criticisms of Perry, isn't helping him. And there's a real alienation among Republicans from anything associated with the party establishment. So there's a school of thought that the establishment will stop Perry, the former Bush guys will stop Perry, and even if they wanted to, and some of them do, they're not capable of it, and attempting to do it in a way that is evident and can be seen by anyone would probably help Governor Perry.
Well, there are sort of subtle ways to do it, right? I mean, probably Roe is not going to be expressing his contempt openly much more, but he really hates the guy. I don't think there's a lot of doubt about that, and surely there are sort of quiet things he can do to make life difficult for him. He can influence fundraisers. He can direct fundraisers in other directions. He can, do lots of stuff behind the scenes. Or he can fold, right? I mean, if Perry really is unstoppable, then Rove is just going to sort of eat crow about all this. But that's hard for me to envision at the moment.
Well, I mean, a lot hinges on Iowa, and if Bachmann is fading, which certainly is nationally, I don't know whether she is in Iowa, and in fact, this vaccine attack, which really backfired against her in a spectacular way, especially among conservatives. I've been shocked, but commenters on our site just cannot stand her anymore because they think she is so ill-informed and demagogic on that. But I wonder how it's playing in Iowa. Because among her base, there are a lot of people out there who are not very friendly to vaccines. So but Mitt Romney desperately needs Bachmann to be real in Iowa and have staying power, because if Perry wins Iowa, then the best case scenario for Romney is a long drawn out two-man race on the Obama-Hillary model, and that's the best case scenario because it's very possible that Perry wins Iowa, wins South Carolina, and it's all over, because the historical pattern of the Republican Party the last 30 years, someone wins Iowa, someone wins New Hampshire, and then South Carolina breaks the tie. And a scenario where Perry's winning Iowa and Romney's winning New Hampshire, Perry would be in a very strong position to break that tie.
Well, this is sort of assuming, kind of if present trends continue. And it's September now, and voting begins in 5 months.
Yep, no, that's always a useful caution. I think Romney, he's going to have to rely on the electability argument, basically, but he can't make it himself, and I think that's one mistake he's made over the last couple of weeks. He shouldn't be out there talking like a political consultant, and the reason to support him is that he's electable. He should let others make that case and others figure that out, and what he really needs is a gap to open up between him and Perry in the head-to-head against Obama, and that's what he hasn't had to this point. You begin to see a little bit of it, but it needs to be Romney beating Obama by 10 points and Perry tied, I think, for it to work for Romney, and I don't discount that kind of gap opening up, but we don't see it yet.
At the moment, Obama leads them both, which is sort of amazing given the state of the economy, right?
Yeah. So, talk to us a little bit about your shoe-in theory.
Right. Well, I think it's remarkable. I think that a president presiding over this economy ought to be in serious electoral trouble, but I think he is the luckiest man who ever lived, and he started being the luckiest man who ever lived when he first ran for the U.S. Senate, and his opponent kind of blew up in a sex scandal, great sex scandal. Do you remember that one?
I'd prefer not to remember that. I was referring to.
Really tawdry. Well, now there are no sex scandals, but the two likeliest opponents are Rick Perry, who seems almost a hologram designed by liberals to alienate independents, and you've got Mitt Romney, who will have more appeal to independents, but who has a huge Achilles heel, and that his greatest legislative achievement is actually a huge liability with the party faithful. That's an amazingly good position to be in if you're Obama, right?
Yeah, although if there's a double dip, I just think all bets are off, and we might be on the cusp of one. And I think his residual strength that you're hitting on is a factor of people. They haven't quit on him. They still like him. They still want him to succeed. But if we take another jag down, outside of the horrible economic and human consequences of it, I think people may give up and stop listening, which really has not quite happened.
But
yet.
one would have thought that would have happened by now. I mean, this is a real
Maybe.
stinker of an economy we've got here.
Maybe. I mean, if he goes down, if we go down in a double dip and he still has that sort of strength, I'll join you in being totally stunned and amazed. But I think he's quite vulnerable. I think he would election held today. I think he'd lose to Romney or Perry.
You do?
Perry. You know, one thing I've been very impressed by with him, and maybe I'm making too much of it, but it's just the sheer relish he brings to politics. He's great on the campaign trail, great at pressing the flesh, even in these debates, you know, where his performance has been uneven at best. He seems to be really enjoying himself, and so I don't discount that. Even though in theory independents are supposed to be turned off by this cowboy boot-wearing guy from Texas who reminds them of the last guy from Texas that they got quite sick of at the end, I don't discount
and he wants
that
to
people
repeal
are,
the 20th century, basically.
well, he's not. That's not the way he's going to run, though. And you've already. That's kind of the interesting thing about Social Security is he, as was inevitable, he's basically come all the way around now to what is a standard Republican conservative position on Social Security,
right,
which is you grandfather in everyone on it or close to it, and then let's talk about how you make it a better deal for young people. But he's
a really long time to get there, though.
What's that? Well, yeah, a couple
for
weeks.
For most people, it would be 2 days, and for him, it was more like 2 weeks.
A couple weeks, yeah. But it's still kind of clothed in this amazingly incendiary rhetoric. The Ponzi scheme, which I think is pretty defensible, is not so much of a problem.
Yeah, the Ponzi scheme actually was not the big problem. It was
the failure, the unconstitutional.
Yes, that was the problem.
So I mean, and that's the danger of Perry, right? Is you can take standard conservative positions and present them in the most inflammatory way possible, which is you would think is not the best political salesmanship.
Right. And also take positions that are well beyond what the standard Republican position is. Will he keep doing that? Can he control himself? I mean, he's learned what you have to say about Social Security. Has he learned what you have to say about the other 100 issues out there?
Yeah. Well, when he said that thing about Bernanke and treason, I just said to myself, if I'm a Perry guy, I tell him, you never have to say anything controversial ever again. That's established. It's established that you're a blunt talking Texan. Never again.
Let's beat up Ben Bernanke. Yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah, but he doubled down on that in the debate, which was rather extraordinary as well. I think it's just partly reflecting this temperamental distaste that people in the conservative base have, and I think probably in the liberal base as well. It's just they don't want someone to apologize. Even if someone said something they probably should apologize for or back off from, there's a real premium in our political culture now to sticking to it no matter what, and that's certainly been the way Perry has been handling himself.
Let me ask you a psychology question. Pretend you're David Brooks for a second. You're looking behind the electorate. Why has the base gone so... I mean, how do we explain what has happened to the Republican base in the last 3 or 4 years? Is it purely the economy?
There is a hint of disapproval in your tone, of course, that I do not.
I'm trying to be a man of science here. It has changed. The base has changed. You would agree. It has changed in its outlook.
I think it's intensified. But is this really that different from what the Republican base was like in the late 1970s?
Yes, I would say.
How so, do you think?
Well, first of all, the spectrum was much further to the left, so I guess it's a question of
Well, the country spectrum was further
Yes,
to the left,
yes,
right? Is
yeah.
that what you mean? Yeah.
Well, it is hard to separate out the question of, are people crazier, or do crazy people have easier access to cable television and the web, which is the eternal question. And when they do have easier access to cable TV and the web, does that actually increase their influence? I don't know the answers to these questions.
I don't think people are any crazier, and I think there's an equal number of crackpots that you can find on both sides. But in general, I think what we've seen in the conservative base is a very welcome thing. I mean, highly energized and engaged, and it's a product of one, just being through with Bush exhaustion, TARP, which a lot of Republican base just couldn't abide, and they saw as a function of the establishment that they can't abide.
And interestingly, they blame the
Obama.
government rather than Wall Street for putting the government in the position of facing the choice that it faced.
Yeah, well, I mean, they blame that they don't like the idea of bailouts.
Right.
They thought you saw very foolish and reckless behavior being rewarded. In effect.
But you also saw some concentration of banks, consolidation of banks. The greater the consolidation of the banking industry, the harder it is for you to sort of shrug your shoulders and say, let it fail.
Perhaps, but they would have liked to see people who make catastrophically bad business choices fail. And then there's just the reaction to President Obama and the way he's governed. And I mean, a really, Tim, this might be hard for you to grasp or credit, but a really sincere belief that the country as we've known it and as we've loved it is slipping away. And its fate will be decided in the next few years. So if you've been sitting there, watching cable TV and just complaining to your wife, that's not adequate anymore. You got to get out there and get involved and try to change things. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And I favor political involvement, no matter who it is. So you have energized liberals that are getting out there. Good for them. Let's all get out there and let's fight.
What is the base? Now, where does the base stand on Dodd-Frank? It seems to me that in that case, you have what appears to me to be sort of a gap between legislators carrying water for Wall Street on the one hand, and a base that hated TARP and therefore must on some level hate Wall Street, right? Why the disconnect there?
The disconnect between
I'm positing that there is a disconnect.
They should hate Wall Street for being
They
bailed
should say,
out.
rein in those bastards who.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think there is some of that. You see it in the and you had a post on this the other day. The rise of the crony capitalism charge. And these bankers, and this is a pretty standard conservative critique, that you have these bankers who are very powerful and well-heeled and very plugged in. So when push comes to shove and they've gambled with their own money and lost catastrophically, they come and use our money to save themselves from the consequences, whereas if you're the small business owner who's made a disastrous choice, you just sink under the waves and no one hears of you again or bats an eye, and that's wrong.
Why is that not accompanied by, for example, an interest in supporting the regulatory process, Dodd-Frank, in supporting the consumer agency? Does the base hate Elizabeth Warren?
I'm sure they're not fond of Elizabeth Warren. I would say Dodd-Frank is identified with a massive and kind of heedless regulatory overreach, this bill that no one really quite knows exactly what's in it or how it's going to work. I doubt, there aren't many conservatives I know who are opposed to all bank regulation. I mean, banks should be regulated, but you want to do it in an intelligent and understandable and coherent way. And I don't think they see Dodd-Frank as being that. So it's interesting, though. Dodd-Frank is now it's kind of bumped up the scale of things that conservatives want to repeal. It gets a couple name checks almost every Republican debate now.
What about the consumer agency, though? I mean, how could the base be opposed to an agency that is mostly about disclosure?
Well, they. I must confess, I do not know much about Elizabeth Warren's handiwork.
Mm-hmm.
But
It's
I'm
a pretty.
sure
It's a pretty meek.
being,
It strikes me as a pretty meek little agency. That it's all about disclosing things to consumers. Very little of it has to do with actually imposing any restraints on. I mean, there are other parts of Dodd-Frank that want to impose restraints on bankers, but the consumer agency is essentially, getting rid of, what's her phrase, tricks and traps. It's about making banks disclose more clearly to consumers what it is, what their choices are. I don't see how that got to be controversial.
I know people who follow this closely on our side would disagree with you, but I don't know enough to take you on that. In general, it seems to me we've had a history of financial crises and then massive regulatory efforts in response that don't really stop the next crisis. And Sarbanes-Oxley would be a great example of that. Hugely expensive regulatory burden in response to a tech bubble that didn't stop the next bubble. So my view is, Dodd-Frank. We have Dodd-Frank. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have banks brought down by something else. They may be brought down by Greece, and they'll be right there with their hands out looking for a bailout again.
One interesting thing I noted in that post that you mentioned was that some of the rhetoric actually does overlap between the sort of right-wing populists and the kind of liberal types like Elizabeth Warren. The complaint about General Electric's taxes, for example, is virtually identical coming from Warren and Sarah Palin.
Yeah, and it's a huge crowd pleaser, as we saw in the last debate when Newt brought that up. This is the one thing, going back to Perry, it's going to be very interesting to see the renewed conservative interest in the whole crony capitalism theme and how that collides with Rick Perry's record in Texas. And we've already seen a little bit of it with the Gardasil controversy. You're going to see much more of it in the weeks to come.
What are the other vulnerabilities there?
Well, you just look, and I don't know anything besides what I've read, but it seems as though a lot of Rick Perry donors had business with the state, and that's an inherently dicey business. And no one's asked him anything about it. None of the moderators have in any of the debates, and none of the other candidates had brought it up until Michelle Bachmann brought up Merck in the Gardasil context. And as we've discussed before, the whole vaccine thing was kind of a misfire. But to me, that was.
Do you think some of this is
a first shot, and what's going to be really a
fighting the last war? That George W. was, seems to be much more of a kind of sort of inside player in that respect than Rick Perry was.
What do you mean by inside player?
Sort of doing business the old-fashioned way in Texas, kind of benefiting from crony capitalism. The Texas Rangers is basically a story of crony capitalism, right?
Yes, his connections, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Byron York wrote a very good piece about that way back in the
and
day for the American Spectator.
He kind of got away with it. Probably a worse offender than Perry was. Do you think maybe that's why Perry's getting it so much this time out?
No, I think the crony capitalism thing has arisen in a response to Obama's policies, and it'll just inevitably have to be applied to what Perry's. People have to look through that prism at what Perry has done down in Texas, and you have all the. And this is what Romney's counting on is all the more minor candidates feeling as though they need to tear down Perry, especially to try to get some traction in Iowa. And that's why I thought it was a mistake for Romney to be so aggressive on Social Security. I don't think he really has to take Perry on much himself, because one, the press is going to do it. Two, these other candidates, especially Bachman, are going to do it. So I was a lonely supporter of Romney's try to fly above it all strategy.
One last question, because we've gone over, I think. But what do you make of Mitch Daniels suddenly talking about, how it's not too late for somebody to get in? Is he talking about himself?
No.
What is he talking about?
I think he's talking about Chris Christie. Daniels, I really think Daniels should have run. The family considerations, but these two guys. There's some enthusiasm for Perry, but some doubts and fears, and there's no enthusiasm for Romney, but some support for him.
Is it too late for Chris Christie?
It's. I don't think it's too late. It would be a massive risk, because he has to go. He would have to go very soon now, and so he'd go before these legislative elections, off-year legislative elections in New Jersey. I think it would be hurt presumably every Republican in the state. So it would really potentially set back his project in New Jersey, and then there's just no coming home again. He'll never be the same. He can't. If he runs and loses, he'll lose his reelection as governor of New Jersey, and it's just all over. So it's much more of a risk for him, and he's just. There's still rumblings, but he's, in public at least, has been so categorical, not just in saying 100% no, but also saying I'm unprepared.
Yeah, that's not good.
and he seemed to be sincere about that. Now, I think he's more prepared than President Obama was, so I don't know. I've always given Christie about a 1% chance. Maybe it's about a 5% chance now, but I think there would be room for him in the race. How he played ultimately, I don't know, but there's still enough discontent with Perry and Romney that you have people looking for others, including Mitch Daniels himself.
Anybody else we're not thinking of?
I don't think so. It's hard.
A man coming out of the East.
What's that?
A silhouette coming out from,
yeah.
Like in a Sergio Leone movie.
I don't think so.
You think it's impossible that Daniels would get in at this point?
Yeah, I don't think he ever really wanted to run, and then his family didn't want him to run, and it would be really late now, and Christie has a star power that Daniels doesn't. I'm a huge admirer of Mitch Daniels. I think he gets it on so many levels, but Christie has a fundraising base and a star appeal that would make this kind of late entry possible. But if Daniels got in at this point, he would, I think, there'd be some risk of just being a fizzle.
All right, well, it's been fun talking to you.
All right, Tim.
And
enjoy your new gigs. Enjoy both your couches.
I will, and enjoy married life. Are you wearing a wedding ring? Can you show the folks back home your wedding ring?
I am. There
excellent,
it is.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Well, till next time.
Okay. Thanks so much,
bye.
Tim. Take care. All right. Bye.